Hello there, namaste. So, how an Indian monk changed Japan forever. History of medieval Japan. I'm curious about this. I have a fascination with Japan. I've been interested in it since I was a kid. I've been following One Piece for longer than half my life. I was gonna say longer than I've been alive, and I'm like, wait a minute, that's the wrong thing to say. Longer than my dog's at the door. Hang on. Does my chair prove how long I've been a fan of One Piece? Yeah. But yeah, I've been a fan of anime for a long time. The history of it, like how it ended up coming here into the Americas. You know, that whole thing. I learned all that. It was the World War II, sadly, the history of that and how it ended up. But yeah, I digress. But yeah, this is how a monk changed Japan forever. An Indian monk. There we go.
Historical Japan. Fascinating and unique, but also deeply misunderstood. Popular conceptions of Japan imagine an isolated nation whose foreign influences were limited to the Sinosphere. And that's just plain wrong. Its historical connections stretched quite a bit further than East Asia. Nowhere are these connections more evident than in the remarkable story of a South Indian Buddhist monk named Bodhisena, who journeyed to Japan in the early 8th century only to find himself at the center of a political firestorm involving Emperor Shomu and the Shinto elite. Due to his cultural background and religious training, Bodhisena was tasked with the handling of a ritual intended to save Japan from
It's interesting. He has really changed his style of art in since from how he, I don't know if this is how he started, but yeah, this is apparently one of his older videos. Well, a year older than the other ones. This is from the 2019, and the others are like from 2022 that I've been watching, the 2023. Yeah, this is 2019, and just look at the style. It's different. The animation is completely different. Yeah, I like it.
the brink of disaster and deepen the influence of Buddhism on its shores. No pressure. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's start at the beginning. Bodhisena was born in the Tamil Pandya kingdom in 704 CE in the city of Madurai. Little is known of Bodhisena's early life, though it's likely that he was born into a Hindu Brahmin family and only later converted to Buddhism. In Japan, official court records refer to Bodhisena as Baraman Sojo, meaning the Brahmin abbot. This gives us some insight into his background. Historically, Buddhists expressed a missionary ethos, which enabled them to rapidly spread their beliefs among both commoners and the learned elite. Relentless proselytization was known to have lured many Hindus, including those from prominent families, towards the austerities of monastic life. Bodhisena could have been one such candidate, but the decision to abandon Hindu tradition and become an ordained Buddhist monk was not an easy one, and often led to public disagreement and communal anger. It was not uncommon for families and close-knit communities to crash ordainment ceremonies and protest. Given his caste standing, it's likely that Bodhisena encountered resistance to becoming a monk. This would have been further compounded due to the era. By the early 8th century, Buddhism was on a precipitous decline throughout the Indian subcontinent. It's clear then that Bodhisena was not only devout, but also a willing outcast and a bit of an oddball. What came next simply confirmed it.
You know, the fact that he's an oddball, I kind of like him. It's funny because the animation does tell a lot different story, because here it's a slower pace. There's not as much going on. I'm trying to listen to what's being said. It's harder to, it's a lot quieter. I'm going to say this video, I had to actually bring up the volume because it's much quieter than the other ones.
In his early 20s, Bodhisena came to believe that he was receiving divine inspiration from the Manjushri Bodhisattva. Who's that? In the Buddhist canon, Manjushri is revered as the Bodhisattva of wisdom, and is one of the closest companions and disciples of Gautama Buddha. You know, the original. Bodhisena became obsessed with meeting Manjushri. Only one problem. The real Manjushri had been dead for more than 1,000 years. But that wasn't going to stop Bodhisena. He soon learned that some practitioners believed an incarnation of Manjushri resided at Mount Wutai, one of the 4 sacred mountains of Buddhism in China. And so his journey began. Sometime between...
That's the calling he has. That's the thing. He was being his true self. It's always cool to see someone who commits to who they are. They don't bog down to the surroundings, the world around them with what they're being told. They feel a calling to something. Yeah. And they go for it. It's easy to see it from the outside in. I have a family member who did something with I absolutely don't agree with, and I can never go visit this person. I just would never be able to. It would be a slap in my face to see someone who's completely misunderstanding the world around them, because their view of the world is so insular in everything. Even though I can view it from the outside, like if I saw this family member of mine who was, if there weren't a family member of mine, I'd be like, oh, at least they found who they are. But it's different when they are a family member. So thinking of it that way, it's like kind of sad for the family.
720 CE and 730 CE, Bodhisena boarded a ship en route to Tang Dynasty China along the Maritime Silk Road, and finally completed the long journey to Mount Wutai. Having arrived at Mount Wutai, Bodhisena experienced a rather serious setback. He was told that the incarnation of Manjushri was actually living in Japan, not in China as he'd originally been led to believe. Following this encounter, Bodhisena puttered around for a few years, teaching and engaging with other practitioners. His story might have ended in obscurity if not for a streak of good luck and committed networking. At some point in the early 730s CE, Bodhisena made his way to Chang'an, the renowned Tang Dynasty capital. There, he made the acquaintance of the 10th Japanese ambassador to China, Tajihi no Mobito Hironari. The ambassador was a devout Buddhist and developed an admiration for the learned Bodhisena. This eventually led to an invitation. Hironari and his delegation requested that Bodhisena come back with them to Japan. With the path having been formally cleared, Bodhisena agreed. He traveled alongside Hironari's delegation, boarding a ship that was headed to Japan via the Champa Kingdom to the south. Bodhisena's maritime journey to Japan is itself noteworthy in that the ship was carrying a veritable dream team of cultural icons. Here's the tasting menu. Butetsu, a Cham disciple of Bodhisena who wrote a book on Sanskrit grammar and developed a style of dance representing stories from Indian mythology set to Southeast Asian styles of music. This dance form later came to be known as Rinyu-gaku, or Champa dance. Genbo, a prominent Japanese scholar monk and bureaucrat of the imperial court who was returning from China with over 5,000 written sutras. Kibi no Mikibi, a scholar and nobleman who returned from China with the popular strategy game Go, as well as Chinese-style embroidery and lyre music. In August 736 CE, after a difficult journey plagued by rough weather, their ship arrived safely at the port of Naniwa, today known as Osaka. Bodhisena and his companions were welcomed by Gyoki, the most influential Buddhist monk in Japan and a trusted confidant of Emperor Shomu. According to imperial records, Bodhisena and Gyoki immediately recognized each other from a past life. Gyoki said, "On the holy mount, in the presence of Sakya, the self-consistent truth we swore has not decayed. I have met with you again." And Bodhisena responded, "The vow we swore together at Kapilavastu has borne fruit. For the face of Manjushri I have seen again today." Translation? Gyoki told Bodhisena that he remembered them once having been disciples of the Gautama Buddha at Vulture's Peak, a sacred mountain where Buddha once preached. Bodhisena agreed and went further. He recognized that Gyoki was not just some lowly disciple. Oh no, Gyoki was a big deal. A really big deal. In fact, Gyoki was the incarnation of the Manjushri Bodhisattva that he'd been looking for all along. Soon thereafter, Bodhisena was brought by Gyoki to the imperial capital Nara. In Nara, Bodhisena was presented before Emperor Shomu, who lavished him with praise and titles and gave him a permanent home at Daionji Temple. All this sounds a little bit too convenient, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Well, yeah, of course it does. Historically, Buddhist monks were neither apolitical nor detached from
They were using him as a figurehead. Ah, gosh dang it.
worldly affairs. As a high-ranking monk from the Indian subcontinent, with native proficiency in the liturgical language of Buddhism, Sanskrit, Bodhisena was accorded an extreme level of deference in the Far East. He had the power to legitimize those who lacked this geographical and linguistic advantage, and he used this power to help solidify Gyoki's position at the top of the food chain, which also meant that he was legitimizing the considerable influence of Buddhism on Imperial Japan. So what could have motivated this maneuver? Consider the historical context of Japan in the early to mid-8th century, a chaotic and unstable era known as the Tempyo period. It's during this period that Emperor Shomu ascended to the throne and began the lifelong task of elevating the status of Buddhism in Japan. Naturally, the emperor's plans weren't received all that well by the country's Shinto elite. See, Buddhism was a young religion in Japan. It had been first introduced only 2 centuries earlier and remained something of a minority belief. Many weren't comfortable with the fact that it was a foreign religion, and weren't too happy with the fact that Buddhist monks were playing an increasingly significant role in political affairs. Emperor Shomu was so devout that he believed governance of the entire country should be aligned with Buddhist principles. As such, he took steps to integrate monks into Japan's bureaucratic machinery, raising them to prominence as advisors, administrators, and even regional governors. The impact of these changes was exacerbated by several years of drought and a smallpox epidemic that
And of course, people are going to blame the changes.
ravaged Japan in 735 CE. By 737 CE, over 1/3 of Japan's population had been killed. The epidemic hit Nara and the political elite particularly hard. Though Emperor Shomu was lucky enough to survive the epidemic, 4 of the 10 main councilmen tasked with ruling over the country had died. It just so happened that the 4 dead councilmen belonged to the Fujiwara clan. Emperor Shomu cleverly decided to replace them with members of rival clans, which meant that there was no united faction to oppose his unpopular decisions. Fujiwara supremacy, traditionally a check on the power of the emperor, was broken. To understand just how unabashedly embedded Buddhist power was during this period, let's consider the scholar monk Genbo, who
Why did they make... There's probably a reason why they made him look like that, but why did they make him look like that?
served as an imperial bureaucrat. You might recall that he was one of Bodhisena's traveling companions aboard the ship. Genbo was a lecherous man, known to be fond of beautiful women and unafraid of making his feelings known. Emperor Shomu didn't really seem to mind. Not only was Genbo a monk, and therefore given a long leash, but he'd also achieved a high social standing upon his return to Japan, when his ritualistic services were believed to have saved Emperor Shomu's mother from smallpox. Genbo was gifted a substantial grant of land and 8 personal servants to see to his every need. A very chaste, spiritual existence. One day, in 738 CE, Genbo went overboard. He made lewd overtures to the wife of noble lord Fujiwara no Hirotsugu. Not a great idea by any stretch of the imagination. Hirotsugu was known as a bit of a hothead, and his branch of the Fujiwara clan had only just had its centuries-old influence reduced. Hirotsugu was tired of these monks, and he filed a formal petition with Emperor Shomu to remove Genbo from his position. Really, this was a test. Would the emperor see reason? Nope. Genbo and his friend Kibi no Mikibi, also from the ship, responded with a counter-petition to strip Hirotsugu of his titles and position. Genbo's petition won, and Hirotsugu was demoted to vice-governor of distant Daizafu province. By 740 CE, an angry Hirotsugu raised an army and began a rebellion against the crown, stating that the capital was corrupted by those like Genbo and Kibi no Mikibi, and that it was the emperor's poor decision-making that had brought the fury of heaven and earth down upon Japan. But Hirotsugu was unsuccessful. In just a year, his rebellion was crushed. Still, Emperor Shomu was not entirely short-sighted. In the wake of the bloody rebellion, he exiled Genbo to Kyushu province for his role in precipitating the whole affair, where he was reportedly killed by Hirotsugu's ghost. Meanwhile, Kibi no Mikibi was punished with the governorship of Chikuzen. This fractured society, Imperial Japan in the 730s, 740s, and 750s CE, is what Bodhisena encountered when he settled down in Nara at Daionji Temple. Both Bodhisena and Gyoki...
So they're getting back to the story. For a second, I was like, wait a minute. This was all about how an Indian monk changed Japan forever. And they spent the last 5, 6, 7 minutes talking about the whole political landscape.
Gyoki would play a role in healing this weakened Japan, and in so doing, also establish a permanent foothold for Buddhism in the country. Gyoki was a charitable man and popular among the peasantry. He led many missions meant to help the poor, from construction projects to classes on agricultural innovation. By the time Bodhisena arrived in Japan, Gyoki had become a powerful and influential ally of Emperor Shomu. So significant was Gyoki's influence, in fact, that he was able to convince Emperor Shomu to begin construction of the Tadaiji Temple in Nara in 738 CE, a decision that sent the country spiraling even further into debt. Gyoki and Emperor Shomu made certain that Bodhisena was a central figure in the completion of the Tadaiji Temple. When the temple was finally consecrated in 752 CE, the eye-opening ceremony for the Vairocana Buddha statue within, to date one of the largest bronze statues in the world, was conducted by Bodhisena himself. From an ideological perspective, it was absolutely necessary that Bodhisena's symbolic legitimacy be engaged. The eye-opening ceremony was seen as critical to the health of Japan and to its future success. Construction of the temple had been lengthy and arduous, and the ceremony was highly anticipated. With the country teetering on the brink of collapse, the eye-opening ceremony was meant to purify Japan and definitively end the streak of bad luck that had haunted it for nearly 2 decades. It was also meant to counter public concerns that the Buddhist devotions of Emperor Shomu had inflicted suffering upon Japan. Gyoki was fully committed to this lofty cause. Though he died before the eye-opening ceremony took place, he'd set the stage perfectly for Bodhisena to carry out the plan to completion. See, mere months before Gyoki died, he embarked on an ambitious task, melding the 2 conflicting ideologies, native Japanese Shinto and foreign Buddhism. Gyoki understood the political ramifications of Shomu's reign, and how important it was for the continued success of Buddhism that it be integrated into the core Japanese belief system. With Japan still reeling from several years of drought, smallpox, armed rebellion, and a debt crisis, Gyoki went into the forest to meditate on the nature of Shinto and Buddhism. He returned having discovered that the Vajrayana Buddha was compatible with Amaterasu, the Shinto sun goddess and mother of the imperial line. He also noted that Shinto kami worship was compatible with Bodhisattva worship. What gave Gyoki the authority to make this grand religious assertion? Recall that, very conveniently, he was deemed the incarnation of Manjushri according to Bodhisena. And who better to meditate on the nature of truth than Manjushri? Gyoki brought this discovery back to Nara, and just before his death in 749 CE, imbued the emperor with Bodhisattva precepts. This effectively created a new role for the imperial line. The emperor was not only the head of state and divine to Shinto, but now also beholden to the principles of Buddhism. Mission accomplished. In fact, Buddhism became such a deeply ingrained part of Japanese political life that by the end of the century, even the imperial family had grown tired of the Nara monks. In 794 CE, the capital was moved to Kyoto in an effort to curb their influence, thus beginning the classical Heian period. Bodhisena lived out the remainder of his life in Nara until 760 CE. Beyond his role in the specific events we just discussed, Bodhisena had a fairly modest but impactful life. He not only helped found the school of Kegon Buddhism in Japan, but left other cultural footprints too. Bodhisena and his disciple Butetsu lived and worked at Daionji Temple. There, they taught the Sanskrit language, which is believed to have influenced Japanese grammar to a significant degree. During this time, Butetsu also spread Champa dance among the artistic elite, likely with Bodhisena's input on the mythological storylines. Interestingly, Bodhisena was pushing his weight around from the moment he arrived in Japan. In 736 CE, Bodhisena was exploring the outskirts of Imperial Nara when he noticed that nearby Mount Tomi resembled Vulture's Peak, the mountain where Buddha once preached, and where Bodhisena and Gyoki purportedly met in a past life. Bodhisena petitioned Emperor Shomu to rename the mountain to Ryosenji and built a grand temple at the site. Today, the Ryosenji Temple Hall is a designated national treasure of Japan.
Demanded it be renamed?
Sadly, Bodhisena is not widely known, despite his surprising impact on Japan. But whether the world appreciates him, Bodhisena's legacy continues, in Japan's religious culture, in our knowledge of his strange and wonderful journey, and even in the little ceremonies that bring him to life in the 21st century, as in Nara, where a group of elderly practitioners continue to celebrate his birthday by eating Indian-style curry. And now you know.
Okay. I like that. Honestly, there wasn't much about him. There wasn't much. I like how they basically said, oh, he did this one thing. After that, he led a pleasant life. I mean, that is honestly rare. Everything else I've been watching from this guy, it's all impactful. They led highly, or it's an event which led from one warfare, this family tree, this person lost his life in the pursuit of this, his grandchildren took it up, and it's just like, when it follows one person, it's interesting, but I think this is the one I've seen where it's just like, oh, he did this, he wanted to meet this, and he ended up in the wrong place. And then he ended up by chance going to Japan and ended up by chance, causing a whole thing. But yeah. I like it because he was used, it seems like, more than he was really did anything to change it. Maybe I misheard because the volume is much quieter than it was on the others. So, but yeah, I like how it was like, oh, other than that, he led a very uneventful life, or a very normal life. I was like, okay, it's nice to actually have he lived happily ever after instead of the conquest and leaving a thesis of things to look up towards or strive towards. But yeah, I like this one. It's very simple, very not much about India at all, or the Indian monk who changed Japan. There isn't much about him at all. It's more about the political landscape of the time. And that's the thing, is a lot of things happen to be what's happening around, not so much the person in the thing that kind of can help alleviate a situation or help guide a situation. It's primarily the situation that they are in, that they find themselves in, that change it. That's what makes a good story a good story, where a character finds themselves in another situation that they are not used to, or a political landscape that is completely a political climate that's completely different than what they're used to. This would make an interesting story, and then he ends up having a happy life after everything. Yeah, I'm starting to view all these as like movie pictures in my brain. But yeah, I liked it. This was simple. This one was very simple. Seeing the older style is actually kind of nice. Seeing his origins. It's nice seeing YouTubers who, you know, change over time. I've been seeing his newer stuff, and I like his newer drawing and everything. The newer style of doing things. I wonder if he's got an artist to help him, or if he does that all himself. But his old style, it is cutesy and everything. I mean, they had the drawing of the guy who was, I guess it's because he was a lecher, that's why. But thank you all for watching. Talk to you next time. Doodles.